of the magic of Dungeons and Dragons.
D&D is Tolkien, where they get the ring and think, well, Gandalf should have the ring, and then Gandalf takes the ring and goes and destroys Sauron, and then
Right.
and that's how that ends. Because hey, now he's level 20, and then maybe he turns evil.
It's the version of Lord of the Rings that rocks.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Cool. So I have to run. So thanks a lot for your questions, everybody. And again, we have a panel tomorrow at 10 a.m. here, and then another one 1 p.m. on Saturday in the same room. So and hopefully, if you guys can make it up to the keynote tonight, I think it should be pretty interesting.
But we are continuing to take your questions.
Yeah.
We're just losing Mike.
Then you can ask him, oh, what is Mike Merles really like? Right?
He's insane.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, good. He didn't break his legs. Yeah.
Mike's actually getting ready to get in line for a question.
That's right. He's going to go next door, put on a different shirt, and start punking us with questions. Next question.
All right. Speaking of tinkering, you guys have done a great job so far in reaching out to the online community and getting folks involved. Through the playtesting, but also through working with bloggers and stuff like that. Generally, what kind of inspirations are you drawing from the online do-it-yourself community? And more specifically, when can we see Shield shall be splintered in D&D officially?
Wow, that's a complex question. I think a lot of it right now, we're so focused on the core of the game that we have some general base assumptions about the kinds of things that people want to do out there. And as far as drawing inspiration, mostly really drawing inspiration from existing editions of D&D. Now, it's hard for me to give you specific examples because it'll be like, we're having a conversation about the fighter, and I'll be like, oh yeah, and I saw that this guy on RPGNet was talking about a cool thing he did with the fighters in his campaign. And so, I mean, yeah, we do that kind of stuff all the time, right? But being able to point to a specific person or blog or whatever like that, it's a little bit tougher because we're out there gathering all this information and reading all this feedback and stuff like that, and it just becomes this big pile of mush in our brains that eventually forms together to guide our actions up to this point. So when we talk about specific inspirations, largely we're talking about previous iterations of D&D, old campaign settings, old adventures. I mean, I would say adventure experiences are something that really drive us.
Yeah, and also we all play a ton of other games. I mean, we play a ton of board games, we play a ton of video games, we play other role-playing games, and so we obviously are unavoidably being inspired by all of these different things, flowing into the pool. Most recently when it comes to other RPGs, I've been really enjoying reading through Dungeon Crawl Classics and the Mouse Guard RPG. And neither of those has specifically inspired anything, but it's simply inspiring to see how other designers are realizing their goals in a role-playing game system.
Thanks.
Sure.
All right, so just a quick question. With the Encounters program you got in Lair Assault, so are you going to incorporate D&D Next into it, or is it just going to be standalone and just stay 4th edition? I was just wondering that.
That's a bit too far in the future for us to give a definite answer to. We certainly hope that the Encounter system will continue for many years to come, and as we shift over to the new edition, then assuming that program is still going, it would shift over as well.
Okay.
Yeah, Organized plays a big part of the D&D community, right? So we want to make sure that all the different varieties of organized play get some kind of attention.
Yeah.
It's just a little too early to make any decisions.
Yeah, because the only thing we're sure of is organized play, yes. But the precise form, we still have a lot of decisions to make.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Thanks.
Sure.
When you guys are designing what I would call social feats, what sort of balanced thoughts go through your head when you're trying to realize that, hey, I'm taking this rather than taking something that has a definite, obvious use in combat? So, for instance, hey, a thief might have the feat of talk your way out of jail. I mean, take your pick, but how do you actually conceptualize that when you're designing a social feat?
There's a little bit of siloing that already takes place in the game, and this is getting a little bit more down in the weeds on the actual design, but there's a little bit of siloing that takes place in that we, in general, tend to look at our background system with traits and skills as a really big way of delivering a lot of the the stuff you might see in the role-playing and interaction pillars of the game, right? So when it comes to like the specialties and the feats, a lot of those are leaning more on the combat pillar and leaning a little bit more on the exploration pillar as well. In general, we've tried to design, and Jeremy actually touched on this earlier when he talked about how like the specialty system could be pulled out whole. We try and design even our sort of combat focused things so that they are more lateral options as opposed to like straight up power increases, right? And one of the things that allows us to do is, I talked about the sort of variance from our target, right? One of the things that allows us to do is if someone wants to take that, say, more exploration focused feat or that more social focused feat, they're not putting themselves at a big deficiency compared to the guy that took the combat feat. So yeah, the guy that took the combat feat's got more options, he's got more things he can do, and you know, there is a slight power upgrade, but it's not this very pronounced jump. It's not like, you know, okay, well, I do 5 more points of damage every round because I took this combat feat, and now the other guy's just like, well, I'm out of the, you know, I'm out of luck, right? There's a smaller amount of variance there, so that allows us to sort of look at it and say, well, you know what, this guy's going to be able to talk his way out of jail, to use your example. He's going to be able to talk his way out of jail, he's going to get some spotlight time, but when they get into the fight with the hobgoblin jailers as they escape, well, you know, he's going to have a few less options than the guy that took the, you know, the archery feats or what have you.
But hey, he just talked the whole group out of jail.
Right.
And that actually loops back around also to just that bigger concept of balance that we were talking about earlier. One of the differences in how we are looking at balance compared to how we've been working on it in the last 5 to 10 years is in the last 5 to 10 years, the emphasis when it came to balance was on balancing by encounter. And we are much more interested now, even though we do certainly look at encounter balance and how much can a character contribute in a particular battle. We're much more concerned, though, about how are characters balancing out over the course of an adventure. And that really changes your perspective, because when you look at an adventure, and particularly you know, look at a lot of typical D&D adventures, which are a mix of exploration and battle and role-playing encounters. From that standpoint, the person who is extremely effective in social encounters will often have a greater impact on the course of the adventure than the guy who has +5 to every sword swing.
Right, and I guess that's really where my question goes to. Is like, you know, like, again, the jail for the adventure. Well, I'd like to think that hopefully you can avoid jail, not most of the time. You might use that once in an adventure, whereas the combat +5, wow, yep, every time we fight, you know, hey, I can use it 5 times during the fight. Great. And it's, you know, like I love those social skills, but it feels like even though I love them and I seek them out and I want to find the one that's good, it's just so much obvious. Like, hey, that one, that +5 to combat damage. Well, how can you not?
Well, again, that's where the sort of making these lateral options makes it a little bit easier, because we can say things like, well, yeah, you got a few more options at these kind of scenes, this guy's got a few more options at these kind of scenes. The other aspect to it is there's a design element there that is, I probably would never design the feat or what have you that is, this guy can get out of jail for free, right? But I would probably look at it and say, what kind of situation is this? Well, it's a bluffing situation, or it's a diplomacy, or it's a pulling rank or an influence kind of situation. Find a way to then make that adaptable across many different kinds of interaction scenes so that it's a more broadly applicable thing, still retains that good flavor, still gives that player who's angling for the social interactions the thing he's seeking, but also make sure that that comes into play more frequently, because as you say, you're not going to be busting out of jail every adventure, but you're probably going to be talking to somebody every adventure, or you might be trying to get something from someone every adventure, or, you know, I mean, there's more common elements that we sort of drill down to in the non-combat things, because really combat, and I'm sorry to keep rambling because I do that, but combat is a series of sort of rules touch points, and most of those feats point at those different touch points, right? With social things and with exploration things, it's not quite as clearly defined, so we have to find those touch points elsewhere to design towards.
So if I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is that when you're trying to design the social ones specifically for this, you're trying to actually give it a little bit more vagary so that it's not, hey, you can only use this when you're in jail, versus you use this whenever you're influencing.
Right.
Because from the standpoint, again, of balancing from an adventure perspective, we want to make sure that if this is a big piece of your character that you have picked, you sure as heck better be able to access it at least once every adventure.
First of all, I want to say I don't envy your task in redesigning Dungeons and Dragons that's got so much baggage behind it and so much weight. And I think that you guys are doing a great job with it. I especially like a lot of the stuff that you've been putting in and incorporating the new stuff like the advantage, disadvantage system and all that sort of thing. And I know you guys have ideas and suggestions flying at you all over the internet and probably even here at the convention and everything. At what point do you have to just say, this is not part of D&D and this is not going to be in here? Where do you draw the line, I guess, is what I'm wondering with regard to what you put into the next playtest packet or the final product? Well,
we are steeped in the earlier editions, so the earlier editions are one component of our guiding star. But also we're also constantly asking ourselves, is this something Conan would do? Is this something the Fellowship of the Ring would do? We go back to the inspirational touch points that Gary Gygax talks about in Appendix N of the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide. Would this show up in a Moorcock story? That kind of thing. Because there has been drift over the life of D&D and narrative drift, and almost always when that narrative drift has occurred, it's because things have started to drift away from those narrative roots. When it gets to a point where, oh boy, this would never show up in Conan or Middle Earth or in an H.P. Lovecraft story, and again,
this is a pretty broad spectrum. Let's be clear.
I mean, right? It does make our job easy that the game is this, again, crazy mashup of these different narrative streams. But it means we have a lot of rich material to draw on.
Yeah, there's a spaceship and lasers and Expedition to Barrier Peak, so we've got a pretty broad swath to draw on. The other thing I'll say is that in general, what we're actually probably doing more than saying this isn't in the game or what have you is we're not going to focus on this right now because, honestly, I tend to never say never, right? I mean, it really, our whole philosophy is built on that idea that you're going to want to play D&D your way, and so if you want to do the Expedition to the Barrier Peaks campaign where we all have jetpacks and lasers and breathe fire because we're Dragonborn or whatever, that's totally cool. It's probably not as high on our priority list right now because one of the things we're focusing on, and Jeremy can attest to this, is we want to make sure that we sort of hit things in our priority order that is like, okay, this is the most iconic, so we need to get this right and get it out. And this, this is a little bit further down, and that's why we've done the core 4 classes, but that doesn't mean we're not going to do things like the Barbarian and, stuff like that, right? It's just, we have to focus on some things now, some things later. Progress has to sort of roll forward. I never want to say never, but I mean, I'm not joking when I say that lasers and jetpacks and stuff like that's in Barrier Peaks, right? You might see that someday.
I think the easiest way to boil down our answer is when we're looking at something, the question we ask ourselves is, if we took this out, would the game suddenly no longer be Dungeons and Dragons? And so really, if something has to be there for it to be D&D, those are the things we're focusing on right now. I mean, so great example. We can't take the wizard out of Dungeons and Dragons. We can't take the fighter out. We can't take the cleric out. But it's also why right now you're not seeing a focus on, say, the barbarian, because those of you familiar with your D&D history know the barbarian wasn't there in the beginning. But the barbarian will show up. It's just, again, it's a matter of focus. And right now we are most concerned about making the most fundamental aspects of the game shine, because they form the foundation for everything else. Because another thing about classes is that traditionally, all the classes other than the core 4 flowed from the core 4. So once the core 4 are nailed down, then everybody else can start coming into focus.
Cool. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it a lot.
Great. That's good to hear.
So I have 2 main issues, I guess I'll do just one right now, that have always prevented me from saying that Dungeons & Dragons is the best game of all time. It is, but ultimate. So I'll just handle one. The first one. So there's always, you mentioned the narrative aspect, the gamist aspect, role-playing game.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that the most difficult moments of the Dungeons & Dragons table are when those two things come head to head. And a great example of this is, take something very benign from 3rd edition, 4th edition, weapon focus, right? +1 to hit. And you say, well, what does it represent? Well, it represents, you training with your weapon, you're especially dedicated and focused with it. But no, it doesn't really actually mean that. It means you just chose a feat. Someone could say, I'm gonna train for a month. I'm an elf for a year, 10 years, 30 years. I spend 500 million gold. I can't technically gain weapon focus without, in some capacity, somehow cheating. I mean, sure, the DM can say, no, that's fine, that's awesome, go for it. Yeah, I mean, the wizard, I let him fireball at will, whatever. But in some capacity, the game's narrative story side has failed to interact properly with the mechanical side, or at least in the capacity that you understand that the game is balanced. It's the power tech issue.
Right.
Hey, I really want to hit this guy hard. Well, you don't have power tech. Well, what do I do? I mean, other games, Mutants Masterminds, Fate, you know, you can just, I spent a Fate point. It's cheating, but D&D's never worked with a net like that, that narrative net. And so you're always left with, I have my mechanics, I have my story, or my narrative, my simulation.
Although
how do you meld those all together?
I mean, it's a great question, and it's an issue that even Mutants and Masterminds faces. Rodney and I both did writing for Mutants and Masterminds actually before we worked at Wizards of the Coast. That phenomenon is something that is at the heart of the tabletop role-playing game experience, and it is why we consider the Dungeon Master to be as core to the D&D experience as wizards and fighters and rogues and elves and dwarves, because it is the Dungeon Master who bridges that gap. And one of I think actually the and here I'm just speaking on my own behalf. Sure. This is my opinion. This is not the opinion of Wizards of the Coast.
Or me.
Or Rodney. But I think a lot of modern role-playing game design, either explicitly or through implication of how its rules are designed, have sort of given this promise that they can't deliver, that the system can somehow bridge that gap on its own. That if you just have all the right rules, suddenly hard system side and narrative side will run themselves. And it is a promise that really can only be fulfilled given our current tech, and has only been fulfilled through able dungeon mastering, or in other role-playing games, game mastering. It is that storyteller, it is the narrator who weaves all of these things together and takes these things that could be butting heads and makes it so that suddenly they're in harmony. And suddenly an amazing story arises from that experience.
And my group doesn't have this problem, but I certainly would. There's a lot of players who would say that they do have this problem, and from a business perspective too. You know, great GMs, hard to come by, probably even harder to create. I mean, it's nice if you can create the magic DM formula, have it do it for you, but there's a lot of players who say, oh, you know, my DM sucks, and he doesn't do this kind of thing, and from a company perspective, you might say, boy, gee, relying on a great GM to really make our game sing.
And it's true, we are. I mean, this is why we value DMs so much, and why providing good DM tools, it's vital to the game, and really, again, vital to any role-playing game, because it is precisely that person that helps turn the tabletop role-playing game into what it is. Because without that, the role-playing aspect that occurs between the players and then between the players and the dungeon master, it really is going to be a board game.
Right.
Or if you want more of a single-player experience but have narrative elements, you can go play Skyrim. But what D&D can give you, or any other role-playing game that has been inspired by D&D, is that magic that happens when people around the table do something that's not in the books. It's only at their table. At that moment, it's their game, it's their story, and at that point, we are just the happy providers of tools for people to be creating magic at their tables. And it's at that point where it isn't our game, it's everybody's game.
Yeah, call me the eternal optimist, but I actually think there are more good DMs out there than bad DMs, and I know that we always hear the bad DM stories, but it's the same reason you hear bad news all over the news, right? It's because that's what people want to tell you about, because that's what's the interesting story. I mean, occasionally get here was this awesome moment that happened in my campaign, but then you also run the risk of, like, let me tell you about my character, right? The thing about it is, I think there are more good DMs out there than bad DMs, and I think that good DMs are being made all all the time, right? The trick is, since we're relying so heavily on the DM to handle that kind of narrative element that you're talking about, we have to make sure that it's easy for the DM to do that kind of things. Now, that's sort of central to the philosophy of D&D Next in a way that we haven't really talked about to this point. The simplicity of the core rules is a tool in the DM's toolbox.
Right.
Because the simpler the core rules and the more streamlined, the easier it is for that DM to make changes and understand the ramifications of those changes. Likewise, when we start talking about our rules modules and optional rules, we want to make sure that we're very clear when we provide those, not only here's how they work mechanically, but here's the impact this is going to have on your game, right? This is what this is going to do for your campaign. This is what you have to watch out for in your campaign when you use these optional rules, etc. So not only are we relying on the DM to bridge that gap, but we're also putting every tool we can in his toolbox and teaching him how to use those tools, or at least that's the intended goal, so that we can do things like that situation you talked about where the elf trains for 6 months and, well, he can't magically get the weapon focus feat. No. We want to be able to say, DM, if you want to give the bonus feat or whatever for that, do it. Here's the ramifications of it. You're making a conscious decision to do this because that's what fits your game.
And I think that philosophically that's a large difference, because I think you have a generation of players from the last decade or so, from 3rd and 4th edition, this concept of player entitlement, that as a player, I own the rules of the game.
Right.
And I bring them to your game.
Yeah, everybody really owns the rules of the games at the table, because again, it takes players to run the game, just like it takes a DM to run the game too, right? What we really want to have happen is that when players want to do things that are outside of the rules, the DM has what he needs to make the judgment call to make that happen, so that both the DM and the players are getting what they want.
Well, good luck, because
yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a challenge, and also when we talk about the DM shaping things and giving the DM tools, it's really not because we want DMs to be these harsh judges and being these tyrants at their tables. No, we want DMs to have the tools that they need to confidently say yes, and because often DMs say no because there is such a storm cloud of rules in front of them that they're not sure what the ramifications are going to be if they say yes. And so naturally the response is often no, to be just like, oh my God, I don't know what this is going to do if I say yes, so please no, let's move on. I don't want my campaign to suddenly be blown up because I said yes to this player request. And so we again want the system to be tight enough and the core system simple enough where it can be simple so that the DM has confidence to make those calls and to say yes.
Speaking of DM tools to facilitate these things, there are a couple of iconic 4th edition innovations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are a lot, not all are good, but some, in my mind, the swarm mechanic and some version of the skill challenge mechanic are very, or can be, if DM'd well, very, very good tools to represent things like hordes of weedy monsters without the 25 attack roll problem.
Right.
That, for example, certain playtest adventures may have run into. And then
did you have people who foolishly charged into the middle of tribes?
Well, there was the one I'm thinking of is the giant rats, where they're not necessarily a threat. It's just annoying, right?
Right. Sure.
And swarms were very good at managing that kind of combat. And then skill challenges, if done well, seem to be a great DM tool for saying, all right, how can we finesse this issue? But still have player involvement as long as it's skillfully done.
Again, as part of our general philosophy is if there was something in a previous edition, like swarm rules, for example, that worked really well and were a great expression of their narrative goal, there's a good chance you will see it emerge in some form in the next edition.
Right. We may just not have gotten there yet, right? Like,
yes.
I think that's one of the things that is really tough, given that we've never really done a playtest of this scale and length before, and so there's a lot of times where people are like, this is dumb. They don't have. I'm going to pick on you a little bit. There's no swarm rules, right? And it's like, well, we haven't gotten there yet, right? Give it a little time.
Yeah. Right now you're looking through a keyhole,
right?
And there's a whole lot of game for you still to see.
Right. To be fair, we also haven't designed what's behind the door yet, so we're actually just holding up a postcard to the keyhole.
Yeah.
I promise there's something really awesome. No.
I mean, the thing is, I mean, it's funny you ask about swarm rules because a month or so ago, Chris Perkins, Mike, and I were coming up with the swarm rules, and they are heavily inspired by what we did in 4th.
Yeah, something like skill challenges are a little trickier because it was a much larger system, and even though skill challenges sort of evolved over the course of the years, I mean, I even ended up picking up the skill challenge rules for the Saga Edition Star Wars game, and took what we'd learned and integrated it, but then that was a huge chapter in an entire book that was dedicated to that. So it's one of those things that, like, we want to make sure that everything gets a lot of attention, and something of that size and scale needs more attention and needs more time. And it may be that what we want to do is look at what worked well out of that and make something new as well, right? Because not everything comes over whole cloth, because some things worked really well, some things didn't work so well, some things were, a mixed bag, and we want to make sure that we get the good part of that and the sort of philosophical nugget behind that and bring it over and interpret it in a way that works with our new system.
Exactly.
I think one of the opportunities you have, which is always great, is to not only replicate them, but even take them forward.
Right.
Like with swarms, and you may have already done this, and if so, kudos to you, but some sort of banding mechanic that lets you take existing monsters and swarm them on the fly would be a great addition, because that was always the one limitation, right?
Right.
You had to kind of have one.
You'll in the current packet, you will see a nod to that approach in some of the monster traits. If you take a look at the mob tactics ability, where you can actually have certain monsters basically give up their attack to make it so that some of their allies just have one big monster attack. So if you have tons of monsters, that's a way to get out of having to roll a bajillion d20s to resolve their attacks.
Thanks.
You were talking earlier about the 3 pillars of D&D, the combat, the exploration, and the dealing with NPCs. Traditionally, most of the rules have focused around combat. But then with the fourth edition introduction of the skill challenge system, which personally I love, you got a little bit more codification of other scenarios. Can we expect to see more of that in D&D Next, where you have more codified systems for exploration and for interaction, and as such, player options to deal with that?
You can definitely expect to see more DM tools for running those sorts of encounters.
Right.
The game will probably always have a greater amount of rules density clustered around combat. And part of that is because combat is very concrete.
Right.
Once you get into the areas of the game that have much more to do with role-playing and improvisation at the game table, we have to tread lightly with the rules we create, because we want them to be tools in a group's hands, tools that are going to assist the narrative, help provide direction, but we don't want to have tools that hijack the narrative, or even worse, cause the narrative to vanish. And so we have not at this point taken the skill challenge approach that we had in 4th and simply ported it over, because, as Rodney said, we need to find what was the best about it and carry just that forward, because we know one of the issues that many groups have faced using skill challenges, as useful as they can be, because like you, I have found many great uses for them in my games as I've run 4th edition. In some groups, rather than being a tool like that, they've ended up just being a sledgehammer that has smashed the life out of different narrative scenes, because rather than role-playing, the people are just rolling dice. Now, there are certain groups that like that, and that's why it is important to us to provide those tools, because there are certain groups that they really don't want to role-play that much, and they would rather just make a few rolls and move on with their game. So again, we want those tools to be there, but we want to do it judiciously.
Right. There's also sort of 2 sides to that. There's the rule side, and there's the content side. And so, like, I don't know if you've seen the playtest packet. One of the things we've really tried to do in the background system is using our traits, is what we call them right now, push characters into that sort of narrative and that sort of interaction, exploration arena a little bit more, right? So in addition to these sort of hard-coded top-level rules mechanics, we want to put things into the characters that support those different pillars. And once you've got those things in the characters, then it's the player's choice what he wants to focus on, right? Like, oh, I've got this trait that says I'm a knight and I can, get an audience with the local ruler and stuff like that. That's now a thing that player, if he's interested in that, can access, right? If that player's not interested in it, that's fine, right? That you're choosing to focus on a different aspect of the game, right? But so that's something that didn't require sort of a top-level rules construct to inject a little bit more of that other pillar of the game into a character.
I'm just curious because you were saying earlier how you were trying to make it so that characters who are not specifically combat-focused could still contribute as much. And so I'm very much looking forward to seeing how that's all going to shape up. And I think all of us here are really excited to see what's going to happen next.
Cool. Thanks.
You can see a bit of that flexibility already glimmering through the playtest packet in the spellcasters. Because we have returned to a more traditional approach to spellcasting, a wizard, for instance, will have the option on a particular day to prepare all non-combat spells. I mean, and that's one of the wonderful bits of flexibility that's specific to that class, where the wizard on a particular day could just be, I'm not combat guy today. Now, we know he'll still be able to cast probably a spell or two at will if a fight breaks out. But if the wizard wants to have a day where, no, he's ready just to create illusory terrain and maybe charm somebody, that he can do that.
But even in like the rogue, you can already see there's a lot of exploration and skill use that is sitting in the rogue. If you so chose, you could be like take the rogue and take the jack of all trades specialty, and all of a sudden you are Mr. Exploration because I can use all these crazy skills and use them better than anybody else can. Like we're already sort of angling in that direction with the non-spellcasters, just looking at what kind of options naturally fit within that.
Yeah. One of the things I love about the current version of the rogue is you could very easily take the rogue and create a character like Indiana Jones, who is knows all sorts of lore, is really good at dealing with traps and sneaking around. Yeah, he can handle himself in a fight, but like Indy's probably going to get punched in the face a lot because in those movies, Indiana Jones actually spends a lot of time getting beat up.
That's true. That's true.
But he's a master at all of these other skill areas. So in that way, very much a classic D&D rogue.
Okay. A few years back, I was sitting in a big room and they announced 4th edition, and everyone around me was kind of going boo, boo. No one really saw a need for it. And like the only silver lining that most of us heard around me was that they were going to have it online. That they were eventually going to move to online. Now, 4th edition is dying, and we're going to the next. That never really came true. Are they going to do anything like that for 5th edition? I mean,
again, we can't talk about future products.
They kind of promised it in 4th edition.
And
we are not making promises right
you
now.
You do not hear us making such promises.
All right. What online tools? Any of that stuff going to be there, or is it all going to be? Because I've heard you keep talking about the books being most of these tools. Are there going to be online tools?
We certainly want there to be. That's as much as we can say at this time. And that's not only because it's just our company's policy, as is the policy of most companies, not to talk about unannounced products. But that's an example of sometimes why you don't want to do it, where you don't want to announce something before it's actually ready.
Also, I'd like to point out, Jeremy and I just pound on keyboards and make games come out. So the digital guys are much... Sure.
Right.
Sure, but I mean, the digital guys are probably more equipped to handle questions like this than we are, so... we've locked them away in a basement.
Well, but even
coding. No,
even they wouldn't be able to address this question right now.
Yeah.
But the point I was going to make is right now our focus is on the game.
The game. Yeah.
Because that's one reason why we also are not talking about the shape of the physical products. We're not talking actually about books or box sets or anything like that. We're just talking about the game.
Right.
And this is also one reason why we're very careful about referring to just, here are these different documents in our playtest packet. Like this piece is not a piece of a player's handbook. This other piece is not a piece of the Dungeon Master's Guide. No, these are just pieces of the Dungeons and Dragons game that will eventually find their home in actual product.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about the skill system and stuff. You know, I've always actually, you know, liked skills. You know, I played the Rogue way back because they were the only ones that had skills, kind of thing and so forth. You know, and then they got more points than anyone else. But on the other hand, the skill systems always kind of felt like, well, it was added on because people kind of thought, well, there should be some kind of skill system, but that's not necessarily D&D. So going back to your thing of what can we take out and it would still feel like D&D, I would think that might be a place that you could, and just use the ability scores. You know, if you want to climb a wall, well, that's a strength check and so forth. Why do you feel the skill system is important for the core, and a little bit about what place in the game you feel that that's doing? We're talking about a more of an open skill list, and now there's more of an idea of a fixed skill list. You know, how has your feelings about the skill system changed as you've gone through this process?
So it's a great question, because in a year and a half ago or so, God, a lot of time has already passed. The skill system was on the list of things that may or may not survive, because it hasn't, as you rightly say, it has not always been there in D&D. One of the reasons why it has been present in every version of the playtest in some form is, even though it has not existed in the way that we're accustomed to now because of 3rd and 4th edition, there has always been a striving toward it in D&D. You know, even in the 1st edition Dungeon Master's Guide, there was this optional system of secondary skills, and then eventually there were non-weapon proficiencies, and it's something that D&D has always grappled with, partly because it is a way to express things about character that go beyond the domain of class and race. You know, it's a way to say, you know, my character is an awesome sailor and has all of the skills associated with sailing or blacksmithing or what have you. So as we have folded it into our work on the next edition, we've been mindful of its origin, really as a way of talking about your capabilities beyond class. And so because of that, you'll notice that skills are not a resolution system anymore. In 3rd and 4th edition, almost everything you try in the game, you try through the skill system. It is very rare in the last 10 years for you to make ability checks. You're almost always making perception checks, search checks, religious knowledge checks, that sort of thing. And you'll notice that in all of our playtest material, you are instead making intelligence checks, strength checks, constitution checks, and so on. So we want the ability check, and have made the ability check, the core of our resolution mechanics. And if you want to, the skills are another piece of the game that you could drop out.
Absolutely. And
the game's integrity is intact. Right. And that's one of the reasons why we have not put resolution mechanics into the skills themselves. Because the skills themselves are really just an area of knowledge or of proficiency in the world where you get a bonus if you make an ability check having to do with that thing.
It's a little bit of a subtle distinction between skills and ability checks, but I think it's important because it means that if you want to drop out the skills, you absolutely can. It means things will be a little tougher for most characters, but again, that's part of that educating the DM of how this is going to impact your game. The other part about it is it means that, and I think that it means that when we think about skills design-wise, they're a bonus. They're not sort of an expectation. It's a benefit you're getting. It's an extra thing you're getting. So it's not just that like, oh, I'm competent enough at hiding. It's no, I'm really good at hiding. Right. It's an exceptional thing, right? Because most of our assumptions are built around the idea that you're using the ability scores and not taking into account those things as part of like, okay, what's our scale of how high the skills go? And okay, these stealth check DCs need to go up because blah, 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 right? It's more about like, no, okay, people are going to be making dexterity checks to hide, and then the guy that's got the stealth skill, he's really good at it, and like it's a sort of a different take on what skills do, I think.
Yeah, because we do not assume that even if you are using the skill system, that you will have many skills on your character sheet. We are assuming for the typical character no more than 3 or 4, because again, your character is going to be using ability scores to do things, and the skills represent, as Rodney says, highly focused expertise in a few areas. You know, these are a few areas where your character is just a master, and that's what skill training now represents, rather than competency.
Thank you very much.
Sure thing. And we can
First of all,
we can take.
We got a little bit.
Yeah, we might be able to get through all 4 of you, but I think you will be the final 4.
First of all,
Final 4.
let me tell you about my fighter.
Yes.
I've been waiting on this all day.
No, no, oh God, no.
Let me take notes.
His name is Laertes.
Actually, no. Regarding something earlier, regarding the whole good DMs are hard to find thing. Have you guys ever considered an accreditation program, like a little class or like a little a little online thing? I pledge not to use DMPCs overmuch. I pledge not to insert my fetishes into the game. I pledge not to try to write a fantasy novel. You know, I've encountered all these things, mind you.
Yeah.
Did you just come up here to attack my DMing style?
Not the least.
Yeah,
I'm actually moving on to a real.
Rodney's games are just, it's wall-to-wall fetishes.
Non-stop.
No, actually, one thing I did notice in the playtest that I kind of really laud is the progression system wasn't quite so, red queenie, everything gets a +1 to everything every time you level up.
Right.
I really, really like that, and I'm wondering what you guys are going to do when it actually does hit like the equivalent of high level. And secondarily, also with the magic progression, I'm wondering what you guys are going to be doing with higher level spells, because right now you have your chill touch, you have your burning hands. I never really liked the idea of having like a separate spell for each of those. Why not just have a fire magic, and as you level up, you can go from burning hands to fireballs to inferno holocaust things.
Right.
We're probably not
mostly the level up stuff.
We're probably not headed too far in that direction. But one of the things we have mentioned before that I think we can still safely say is part of our philosophy is the idea that like Burning Hands or something like that is a pretty iconic spell. I think we'd all agree, right? We want that to stay in the game, right? So that as you gain levels, you keep using Burning Hands because you've already learned how to use it as a player. It's pretty iconic. We want it to stick around, right?
I would love that. I would love to not have to leave Burning Hands by the wayside because it's no longer good. Fireball is.
Right, and that's one of the things that Burning Hands and Fireball do two very different things. We want to embrace that and make sure that there is occasionally some kind of choice there between the two. As for the sort of progression of numbers and how that's going to impact how we'll play, I already alluded to it earlier, but I think it's actually a big advantage that we have going into our discussions of high-level play, that we don't expect the numbers to reach the point where we're leaving too many things behind. Because I think one of the big challenges with high-level play traditionally has been that in order to fully support high-level play, we need a whole different aspect of our monster manual, our bestiaries, our adventures, etc. That use these higher-level adventures use different pieces and components because you had to, because the players outstripped all the stuff that they dealt with at lower levels. Instead, now we'll have a bigger toolbox for DMs to draw on, a bigger toolbox for us to draw on with our adventures in populating our adventures with monsters and traps and treasures and stuff like that, because we haven't left them behind quite as much. We'll use them differently, right? You'll fight 20 orcs instead of 5, right? But it's a different use of the same thing, which I think is a really, really powerful advantage we have going into high-level play. And I think it's because of what we're talking about there with our bounded accuracy system that's possible.
And I mentioned earlier that as we're working on high-level play, we are questioning all of the assumptions that the previous editions have had about high-level play. And one of those assumptions in the past was a linear scale where every number just,
up by one.
kept just going up, 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 up. For us, even that is not a sacred fact.
Oh, good.
Because the issue is as soon as you assume that has ramifications through the entire system, as Rodney was mentioning, where suddenly, again, whole sections of your monster manual are unusable once you hit a particular level.
It also has just trying to design a world that can be explained by those rules results in ridiculous things. We've all read Order of the Stick. We know how silly it can get.
Right.
Like, for example, it's impossible to to hold someone hostage in D&D. It's impossible to threaten them with a crossbow in D&D because it's a first level dude. It'll deal me 1d8 damage, whoop-de-doo. I mean, I know that's really hard to fix, but I just hope that you guys are already changing the progression system. I think is a really big step. So thank you.
Thank you.
Item a second. So
That's okay.
You mentioned kind of alluded to it earlier, but the resolution concept, and what my friend over there was saying, like, well, it's a game, still has to be an element of skill. And one of the things that I think back to is this idea of how much of an impact the player having skill at the game should influence their ability to win at the game. And what I mean by this is, we've all seen, the guy, you're walking down the corridor, you're mapping the dungeon masters, describing things, and then maybe the old grizzled guy goes, wait. No, there's definitely a trap in this corridor. It's just, the DM kind of hesitated there for a second. There's a little bit too much description and flavor text. Meanwhile, he's playing like an int2, whiz2 barbarian who doesn't, or not even, like fighter who has no trap finding skills at all. And then he's like, I start looking into the crevices, and I'm looking for the pressure plate. And then he goes, yeah, sure. And then meanwhile, you have this rogue who's like, I focused on exploration. I'm Indiana Jones. And I didn't need to even show up here because there's a guy here. But then alternatively, you go, all right, that sounds reasonable. Make a check.
Yeah.
The guy gives like the Braveheart speech. Make a charisma check, 1. And you've all been at that table where everyone wants it to happen. It makes sense for it to happen. And the mechanics slap you in the face with their interaction. I look in this. I look in the drawer. I look every crack in the wall. Make a search check.
Yeah.
And then 4th edition, where it became like a sonar, of just I detect everything in this room.
Right.
So how do you resolve that inconsistency between I want to have a skill system to allow players who aren't a 25-year veteran of Tomb of Horrors and still have them be able to find traps versus a player who's naturally charismatic or just pays attention and has a good feel for the game, and allow them to be skillful at the game outside of just building a good character and kind of sending them in like a Pokemon.
Our recommendation to DMs, and this is advice we've given in 3rd and 4th edition as well, is if a player is playing their character well, we do feel that should be rewarded. So if the dim half-orc barbarian happened to notice, because his player was clever, this crack in the wall that is in fact a part of a secret door, if I were the DM, I would say congratulations, you found it.
And I don't have a problem with that, but I think that for the game as a whole.
But so
how do you know? Hey, these are the rules, but just ignore them.
So the flip side, and this is where we're addressing the issue you bring up head on, is if you take a look in the current version of the rogue, where again the rogue is the skill guy. The rogue is the guy where we don't want a rogue to face something where he is supposed to have expertise, be told to make a check, and then as you say, that the scenario where he gives the equivalent of the Braveheart speech, rolls a 1, and the whole thing is just a big wah wah wah. That's why the rogue has the skill mastery mechanic in the current draft, where the rogue, if the rogue is doing something in an area where the rogue has expertise, the rogue cannot get a result lower than 10. And in fact, if the rogue has training in this area and the fighter has training in this area, almost always the rogue's bonus will be higher, because that's part of what it means to be a rogue. I mean, you are the master of various skills, many of which have nothing to do with battle and everything to do with exploration and social situations. So the issue you bring up is one that has very much been on our mind. Where we do not want that rolling of a 1 to suddenly basically invalidate the character that a person has constructed, and this is an issue that's very much wrapped up in the design of the rogue.
I also think that what you're talking about is a playstyle issue, because there are going to be people that want to play the game in a way where that description is more important than the die roll, right? And there are going to be people that want to play the game where no, just because I'm charismatic doesn't mean that my character should be charismatic, therefore I should have to roll all the time. I think those are both perfectly valid playstyles, right? And I think most people kind of fall in the middle, honestly, but again, we talk about extremes. I think those are two sort of extreme playstyles. In general, I think, though, this is one that is best handled through addressing the DM and basically saying, okay, DM, here's what you can do. Here's a tool in your toolbox. And that tool is, if your players do something that you think should work because they were very specific with their description or they gave the great Braveheart speech or whatever, one of the tools in your toolbox is you can just make it happen, right? Now, like any carpenter, you don't have to use every tool that you own. Like, I built a rocking chair and I used every tool that I own. No, you don't do that, right? The same way with the DM, if he doesn't want to run that game, he doesn't have to, right? Or she, or whatever, right? Like you want to put that power in the DM's hands because it's a playstyle issue, and I think that we will address it mostly with, I don't know, it's not really a rule even, it's just advice for the DM in a lot of ways. Right, right. And so, like, personally, I like that style of play. I like the style of play where it's a little more old school dungeon crawly, where we walk down the room and we pour the water on the ground to see where it seeps in, and that's where the pit traps are, right? I don't want to make my players roll a check for that.
10-foot pole is not a
Right.
+2 to a percentage.
Right. But I know that's me personally, right? Like, I know that might not be everyone here, and that's okay. Like, we should make sure that we can support both. And I can have that just by being able to play the DM trump card and say, no, you don't have to roll for that. Or vice versa, right? Like, you know what? Your character would never notice that. If you were playing an intelligence 2 green slime level of intelligence half-orc barbarian, you would never notice that. But like, that's the kind of style I want to play, right?
And an approach I have used going all the way back to first edition is, and it's sort of a hybrid, where if somebody is playing very cleverly, describes some way they're searching the room where, man, they're going to find that trap, or they give the equivalent of the Braveheart speech. Because so many of the people I have DM'd for over the years like to roll dice, I still have them roll, but rather than the dice determining the outcome, the dice determines the degree of success. Right. And so I will look at, okay, you rolled a 1, but you had this fantastic description of what you're doing. So you did indeed find it, but you fell in it. You know, congratulations.
You found the pit trap with your face.
Yeah. I'm rarely that harsh, and I usually would only do that to a player where I know they would actually enjoy that kind of pratfall. But that's sort of a great way of being able to have your cake and eat it too as a DM.
If, but how much?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And final question.
It better be good.
You've already kind of answered this by saying GM adjudication, but the D20 is a pretty swingy die in terms of probability, you know. And when you're working at a static DC, that's fine. But when you're doing opposed checks, suddenly, you know, the swing is the modifier, not the D20. And that's always been kind of a disconnect for me, because to me, when, you know, all other mechanics aside, I feel like D20 is D&D, you know, and then all the other stuff adds on. But like in that specific circumstance, when there's like an opposed roll versus a check versus a DC, it falls out. And it might be too mechanical to answer now, or it might be too hand-wavy to just say, GM, take care of it. But how do you reconcile that in the new edition?
There is definitely more work for us to do on our contest system. So that's partly just more is to come. But also the D20 has a slightly different role in many of our checks because of the introduction of the advantage and disadvantage mechanics. Right. Because if you are in a contest with somebody and they have disadvantage on their check, suddenly things are very different. Right.
Okay. I mean, I guess the specific concrete but stupid example, because it never comes up, is like, you know, the arm wrestling thing, where the guy with like the 10th strength has only a 20% chance of, you know, failing versus the guy with the 18th strength, but that should never happen.
Well,
some people would say, well, yeah, but the GM should never be roll for that guy with the 18th strength.
Yeah, and in fact, our typical DM advice is in an arm wrestling match, the person with the higher strength should just win. Because our advice to a DM is typically only introduce the D20 when there is significant variation possible in the world of the game, and because the D20 represents sort of the whims of fate, environmental factors. It's used in combat because people are moving so much in combat. There are so many variables that contribute to whether or not, and not only a sword hits, but hits soundly enough to actually deal damage. But in a case where it is simply one force against another, my recommendation is don't roll at all. just the greater force wins.
Yeah, I think we're going to want to be pretty judicious with our use of contests, but I think it's still a useful tool to have. I think those kind of challenges, like you're talking about, pop up, traditionally pretty rarely in D&D, right? Like, oh, the 18th strength guy can't pull the bars off the window, but oh, that 8 strength wizard ripped the bars right off because he rolled a 20. Really, does that actually happen? I mean, it happens occasionally. I think it's something that is largely solved, like Jeremy said, by asking yourself, when is it right to actually make a check, right? And we've given some advice in the previous packet, and I wouldn't be surprised to see it return when we talk about, like, okay, if you see the 18 strength guy walk up to the door, it's okay to say you just kick it down. If you see the 8 strength wizard try and pull the bars off, it's okay to say, no, I'm sorry, you just can't do that, right? I think that's, I mean, you can call it GM adjudication, but really it goes back to what Jeremy was saying earlier. Like, that's the bread and butter of what makes D&D work, is having that DM there to sort of filter everything through.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and we hope you continue to enjoy the playtest, and please continue to send in your feedback.
And if you have more questions, remember we are doing this seminar again on Saturday. Is that right?
Yes.
On Saturday.
On Saturday.